Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's St Edmunds alumni event, a talk by Matthew Bullock on the Cambridge economy. As many of you know, Matthew was master here at St Edmunds from 2014 until he retired from this role in 2019. He was unusual in being the master of Cambridge College, who came from a financial background, having worked in banking for many years, and as somebody who had very close links with the Cambridge business and entrepreneurial community, links that he still retains now in his retirement as he has his spread of interests. We're very grateful to Matthew to be here giving this talk to you this evening, and we're very grateful to you all being here. Are a testament to the international spread of our St Edmunds alumni. I think we have people joining us this evening from as far afield as Canada, United Arab Emirates and Pakistan. So welcome, and let me hand over to Matthew.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's a very special occasion. It's only the second time in a year that I've worn a tie, so I clearly regard it as a red letter day. But it's fun to be doing something for the college in this very strange year that we just passed through. I wanted to talk to you about the Cambridge economy. This is an interesting story. This may be what you think the Cambridge economy looked like, as you remember it. The Cambridge I'm going to talk to you about is not that Cambridge, although that Cambridge remains as active and well as ever. This Cambridge, the new Cambridge economy, that's, I think, taken at the Sanger Centre out at Hingston Hall. And I'm going to talk a bit about how it actually came about, a few slides about that, a bit of history, a bit of analysis, about where we are now, and again, share a little bit of analysis, numbers and data with you, and then where we might be going in the future. So I hope this will be an interesting story, and I'm very happy that we have chance. We have a number of actors here, including Charles Cotton, I know, is on the show, who were also participants in this with me, and I'm sure we can have a lively discussion at the end of my talk. So let's start off. What are the antecedents for this development in Cambridge? Well, I'm showing you somewhere which you probably would not associate with Cambridge. This, of course, is the Dreaming Spires of Oxford, my hometown. Why is this important? Well, it's important because in the 1930s, a man called Morris started to build motor cars in Holywell, which is one of the oldest streets, literally just below the city walls. And his business thrived, and it grew and grew in Morris garages. And eventually, he moved out of Holywell and was found premises to build his cars at a place called Cowley, which is to the south of Oxford. And this prospered enormously, much to the chagrin of the university. And it was generally felt by many people in the university at Oxford that Oxford as a city had been wrecked by this extraordinary growth of motor cars. And at the end of the war, when town and country planning acts were being discussed, a report was drafted by Lord Holford, which set down the rule that there should be no similar commercial development in Cambridge, and that the closest that anybody could open a new business of any substance, would be 16 miles away from the city of Cambridge. And Cambridge remained in that position until, as a result of the Oxford experience, until the 1960s. In the 1960s, the man up in the top left-hand corner, Maurice Wilkes, who had started developing computing in the 1950s, and there he is with a very early memory device, invented something called the Cambridge Ring, which is the beginning of networking of computers. And IBM were very impressed by him. I mean, he has enormous impact in many ways, but they were very impressed with the network. And they came to Cambridge and said, we would like to set up our European research and development headquarters in Cambridge, reflecting Maurice Wilkes's work. And the county council looked at its planning rules under the Holford report and said, well, I'm terribly sorry, the closest that you can come to Cambridge is Hinxton Hall, which is a house which had recently become free, about actually 11 miles outside Cambridge. But this was regarded at that time as so far outside and away from the contact with the university that IBM said they weren't going to come, and they went off to Hursley and off to France. Now, the effect of that rejection of IBM by the county council and the university was quite strong. And the man on the right-hand side is called Sir Neville Mott, and he was the chairman of the Cavendish Laboratory. And at that time, it was quite common for physicists particularly, but also some engineers, to go and spend their summer holidays in America at the AT&T Bell laboratories in the East Coast, working with such remarkable things as semiconductors. And they had experienced this involvement with business, and they were absolutely shocked that IBM had been turned away by the county council's planning rules. And so Sir Neville Mott formed a committee whose secretary was a man called Ian Nicol, who is very influential, who was secretary of the Cavendish Laboratory at the time. And they produced something called the Mott Report in 1968, which said that the university's relationships with business should be extended. This is a very unusual report because at the time, there was a flood of development of new universities following the Robbins Report, which were being financed by government. And the Mott Report very far-sightedly said, we cannot trust government to provide all the money here. We need to diversify our support. And so they said it's critical that we should develop a relationship with new companies. That was approved by the university and was a strategic move towards working more closely with companies, which has continued right through to today. But Ian Nicol, who became secretary of the General Board of Faculties and therefore was in a critical role in academic terms after having written this report, his wife turned out to be on the planning committee of the county council. And he and she conspired and worked to actually change the county council's planning rules so that they withdrew this limitation on companies forming so close to Cambridge, which was very significant. And Ian then went on and developed a series of quite unusual university policies, which were very facilitative of those people who wanted to start businesses. And Ian personally would kind of be benign towards people and say, well, if you want to start a business, I know of some premises somewhere, and he would help them. One of the things that the university did very unusually was it released the intellectual property that it might have held to the individual academic. So that's your affair, not our affair. They were willing to allow individuals to start businesses on part-time basis, because they didn't regard the university as an employer in consuming all their academics' time. And the result was that certainly people started to form odd bits of business in their summer vacs, in their own spare time. And this was very important in just reducing the personal risk which people would face in starting up a business. And we can talk more about these policies, but these were a very significant factor, because it resulted in a kind of different way of forming companies. I'll come back to that in a moment. I'll go through the analytics of that in a moment, but just when did the actual phenomenon start? Well, the best time for dating the phenomenon starting was a meeting that I hosted in the Eagle pub, which you can see just on the slide there in Bennett Street. I was a bank manager. I'd been sent back as having finished my degree and done some economic work. I became a bank manager and was sent back to Cambridge by Barclays. And in that role, I was based in Bennett Street, and which was the major branch of the bank. And I noticed that there were one or two companies there which had been started by academics, including one actually started by involving my brother, although I didn't bank him, he was just a shareholder. And I took an interest in this because, coming from an academic background myself, I wasn't, like my colleagues were, frightened of talking to academics about what they were doing technically. So I realized that there were a few of these companies, and I decided to call a meeting in the Eagle, to which I invited 19 people that I knew were engaged in these companies. And at the meeting, I sort of said, well, how many other companies do we know? And we counted up 36 technology companies. And in the sort of small market town in the Fens, 36 technology companies was really odd. It was kind of inexplicable. And we didn't know why it was happening. So we called it a phenomenon. And that sort of July drinks meeting was kind of where, you know, Herman Hauser, Clive Sinclair, Richard Cutting, the Lang brothers, all the original kind of entrepreneurs were all at that meeting, and it was kind of signal meeting. It turned out that when I sort of poked around a bit, this was not the first time we had had people setting up companies. And the very earliest spin out from Cambridge is actually Cambridge University Press in 1534, which you could say was a technology spin out. But scientifically based technology companies had actually started with Darwin's son. One of Darwin's sons formed Cambridge Scientific Instrument Company in 1881, actually building instruments for the Cavendish Laboratory. And a company called W.G. Pye and Company was started in 1896 and moved into making radios and eventually televisions in Cambridge in the 1920s. I also discovered one or two failed businesses in our own books in the bank from electron microscopy, which had spun out from the engineering lab in the 1960s, but had basically foundered because the cost of the technology, electron microscopes, was just enormous, and it really couldn't be carried out by a small company. The better kind of seeding of the phenomenon actually was through a company called Cambridge Consultants, which was founded in 1960 by a man called Tim Edward and Sutherland. And this was a company that was basically doing technical consultancy. They said, here are the brains of Cambridge. We can make them available to clients who want to develop technical products. We will do the technology for you on a consultancy basis. And this is a very influential company. It's still around and is the father of several other technical consultancies, PA, the Technology Partnership, and Sagentia, amongst others. Also in the 1960s, again, a significant event was that the Wedgie Ben, the Labour government, decided in 1967 to create a computer-aided design centre, which they established in Cambridge. And this led to the development of quite a few computer-aided design businesses in the computer lab. And in the 1970s, before my meeting was held, a number of these companies had started to form. And the conjunction of the technical consultancy and the strength of the computer lab really changed the technological barriers, because computing is a much lower cost form of setting yourself up in business, particularly if you're offering technical consultancy. And as a result of the very benign policies that Ian Nicol had introduced in the university, and this much kind of lower cost for getting going, we started to end up with a different kind of business from the kind of electron microscopy instrument businesses that had started earlier up, and were able to start because without any venture capital. Now, let me just do a little bit of analysis for you. I'm a banker, so I tend to think about what risks are involved. And if you look at this, there's a kind of a range of company styles here. I call these companies soft companies rather than hard companies. I'll explain that. At the lowest risk, you can start off really just doing technical consultancy. You can do analytical reports, you can write test reports, you can do design studies. And this is really the area where these companies were kicking off. didn't need any venture capital. They just needed to have technical skills, which they could sell to a client who was interested in a solution. And all of this work in the green area below that, as a horizontal dotted line, is essentially you have a customer and then you deliver the product, whatever it is in terms of design or bespoke work, to that customer. And it is essentially bespoke. You aren't taking risk of getting into producing a product which you're going to take to market. So you're at this stage simply using your technical skills to come up with bespoke responses, maybe just a study on a piece of paper or maybe a disc, maybe actually moving towards a piece of equipment. But it's a much easier company for an academic to start than somebody who's getting going with a speculative product. People who build a mousetrap and then hope the world will be passed to their door are in the speculative area, and the risks involved in that are much higher. The market risks, the management risks, and the financial risks. So what was happening was that these companies that I was getting involved in the very early stages in the 70s were essentially down the bottom half of this chart. Now, what then happened is actually you start with I'm going up to a macro view, I'm going up to a helicopter view. You start with a research base, which is obviously Cambridge University, and you have lots of these companies spinning out, and then they spin out and they form lots of little soft companies. So this is really what was going on during the 1970s. And these companies then progressively started to turn, once they got going with their consultancy businesses, which has got very good cash flows, it's quite a profitable business. Then they started to work out what kind of products they wanted to produce, and they go through a phase where they move towards increasingly producing speculative products, but selling them to their customers that they already have from the bespoke work, until eventually they end up with fully hardened companies with products. And what actually then happened was that these companies tend to spin out and start on up over again. And then eventually you end up with acquiring businesses coming along from abroad and buying them. And that's actually, this cycle is exactly what was going on in the 70s and 80s in Cambridge. But the importance of the soft company and the ability with the university's policies to start so easily and the low cost of computing kind of made the soft company formation possible. So there we have a number of companies being formed. That's the kind of commercial seeding. The compost heap is starting to warm up and these companies are growing. And what then happened? Well, several kind of validations happened. First of all, Trinity, and down the bottom right-hand corner, you see this man in a black bow tie, is suitably drinking a glass of white wine. That's John Bradfield. And John Bradfield was the bursar of Trinity College. And John was an enormously far-sighted man. And he found that they had some land at the top end of Cambridge at Milton, which had actually been a tank park during the war on agricultural land full of concrete and so forth. And he went to California. He saw the science park near Stanford, and he said, we will have one of those. And he came back and he opened the Trinity Science Park in 1970, and there on the left-hand side is Cambridge Consultants were the first tenant on the science park, and it grew enormously successfully. On the right-hand side is the Knapp building of the science park, and it was so successful that St. John's, who always rivaled Trinity, decided they had to have one too. So Chris Johnson, who's the bursar of John's, traveled around America, and he came back and he set up the Innovation Center. And so there was a kind of, if you like, an academic validation by the colleges that this was a good thing. It was no longer socially stigmatized as it might have been before. Forming your own business and setting up in technology businesses was okay, socially and academically. I played a role in Barclays in that we were very much the dominant bank in Cambridge, and I persuaded the bank that we should support these businesses and that we should give them business advice, which was something which we had developed quite a name for at that time. And if you like, that was a commercial and financial validation of what was happening. And so people sort of felt this not only was it academically okay, but there was actually a bank around who was willing to provide money to get these companies going. Following on from that meeting in the Eagle pub, I also formed with Walter Herriot, who was again a colleague of mine in the bank, something called the Cambridge Computer Group, which was a drinking club, really, where we brought these people together so they got to know each other and started the whole of the networking phenomenon, which is so important part of how the Cambridge economy has grown. And that is the antecedent of something which still operates called the Cambridge Network, which was formed later on by David Cleaveley and others in the early 1990s. And again, that gave the companies commercial self-confidence. I remember talking to Jack Lang, who was one of the early entrepreneurs who went to California to try and sell some of his wares. And he said, oh, I come from Cambridge, where there are dozens of companies like me. Well, he knew who the dozen were because they all had drinks together, but there was no kind of underlying commercial relationship. It just was it sounded like a big deal. And of course, the companies were getting more and more involved in product rather than just in consultancy, so that the result was that the community started to change. It became cool to start companies. There was a company being formed about basically once a fortnight at some points during the 1970s and 80s. And because we were able to structure our finance and their business models in a way which is relatively lowish risk, the failure rate was very low. And the result was that more people came on board because they didn't see people going over the cliff and losing, crashing. It looked like a cool thing to do. And so more and more younger people used to come and meet in pubs and then talk about businesses and get them formed. As the companies grew, obviously it stretched the entrepreneurs. They became much more wise about the ways of the business world. And when the inward acquisitions started to happen, and this is particularly true of the CAD companies. So there were 4 CAD companies formed in Cambridge out of the computer lab. CIS was bought by Computer Vision, the biggest American company. Shape Data was bought by Evans and Sutherland. And Applied Research of Cambridge was bought by McDonnell Douglas. And there was one other business, I can't remember, FEGS, I think was bought by another. This brought in tens of millions of dollars of money into the hands of some of these people who started these businesses. And so money came in as well as academic validation, commercial validation. This was real money. And the result was that kind of the learning, the community learned, and didn't just do more, it actually changed as it did more. And you started to get people like Jack Lang, for example, who and Herman Hauser, who became serial entrepreneurs. And as they started again, they built businesses, they grew, they sold them, and then they took the money that they'd made from having sold the first business and started another business. But when they started the next business, because they had the money and they had hence the equity capital they could put in, and they were just more knowledgeable, the next business they started was a more product-oriented business and grew faster. Some of these people, Herman was one, but started to invest in other people's businesses as well because they'd made enough money first time round. And they started to support new starts, and what grew up around them was an innovation establishment. People like the banks, the accounting firms, the legal firms, the IPR community, all formed around what was going on in Cambridge. And this became a sort of, at the beginnings, this became an ecosystem which kind of had periodic flushing in of money from acquisitions abroad, and then growing these businesses. That also did something very unusual, which if you look back in history at these kind of communities, is really not normal. The community started to switch sectors. So it started off in computing and software, but it moved into telephony, which is a very different business model. And then it moved from there to biotech, and then it's moved from there to medtech. Now, this is a very unusual pattern. You don't normally see that, but clearly people were confident to do it. And as venture capital eventually started to come out from places like London and Boston in the late 80s and early 90s, people were then able to start product companies much quicker than they had been using their own capital within the community. But there was still this enormous volume of soft starts maintaining critical mass but now coming from a much wider range of labs and disciplines. And I'm indebted to Charles for this slide. This is the widening technology scope. So you start in the pre-60s in basically scientific instruments and radio, and then it widens up from there into CAD, and then into inkjets, which was an invention in Cambridge, became quite a big business. And software grew very strongly. And then eventually in the 1980s, you start to get the emergence of life sciences alongside a sort of widening group of companies in sort of the hard sciences. The hard sciences go on growing. You get semiconductors with ARM being formed out of Acorn, but also then the beginnings of larger pharmaceutical companies and monoclonal antibodies. So you get Cambridge Antibody Technology being formed and the development of Humira. And as you can see, it just got a wider and wider and wider range of technologies. And that has been kind of because of the confidence of a willingness to try not only new technologies, but new business models, which stem from the fact that you have obviously different ranges of business you're dealing with. So I don't think I've actually captured, I'd have to put AI in there. Well, I've got AI in machine learning, but it's obviously a very widened scope and is really this kind of scope of technological capability is probably the low tens of centers in the world that have this kind of range of technology as a base. So the other thing that I was involved in at this time was building managerial competence. I was one of the people involved in founding the Judge Business School. Barclays was known as the original business school in Cambridge because we used to sort of teach people how to build these businesses. And I was actually the first external examiner of a business course in Cambridge in 1979. And I persuaded the bank, along with KPMG, that we should fund some lecturerships to support the faculty growth. And I served for 20 years as an advisory board member from the kind of very earliest Judge Institute of Management, well, the Institute of Management Studies, which was in Mill Lane, to the rather swankier Judge Institute of Management building there in the old Addenbrooke's building. And as you can see, it's had an addition of the Simon Sainsbury Centre added in 2015. And it has a good standing in world rankings, noted for its innovation, enterprise and finance teaching. So the purpose of that, as far as I was concerned, was to make sure we had a resource which would support the managerial development of these technological businesses. And I think it has moved on to that. So that's a bit of the history. I hope that isn't too quick a run through. I'm very happy to answer questions later on, but let me move on to sort of where we are now. So from the Cambridge Science Park at the top there near Milton, and then the St. John's Innovation Centre, that is now the number of a map of some of the science parks around Cambridge. I'm told, in fact, there are close to 85 now in the wider Cambridge area, but that gives you some of the more prominent ones, and I'll come back to where they are. But that's kind of giving you an idea of how just physically the thing has grown. Now, I am rather a sad kind of individual, and I count the number of companies. It's been one of the things we've done all the way through. Every year we count, and I and some colleagues in the Judge Business School do this by going off and going to Companies House, and we pull out the turnover and the employment of all the companies in the Cambridge area, and we break them down into 84 different sectoral classifications, and we classify them as knowledge intensive and non-knowledge intensive. And if you think of an area like Cambridge and economy, there are various players in it. So there are Cambridge-based companies, and these are the main ones in which we have very good data. These are companies that are founded in Cambridge, have grown up in Cambridge, and have their main operations there. And we're able to pull data off of those. And people like Aviva, for example, the old CAD Centre business, and Ridgeons, the building supply business, are Cambridge-based companies. There are then non-corporate players like the universities, for example, the knowledge-intensive bit of it, or the arts theatre, which is not. is in culture rather than science. This is also a STEM definition of knowledge intensive. Then we have a number of companies that have come in, and I'll give you data on these companies in a moment. People like Marks and Spencer, for example, who have offices and shops in Cambridge, but they're not Cambridge-based companies, but they're active in the Cambridge economy. Or people like Sanofi, a French biological pharmaceutical company, which has offices here, but getting the data on them is much harder, and I'll explain that a little later on. And then you have the public sector, and then lastly you have sort of sole traders. Now, we're able to get data on the Cambridge-based companies, the non-corporate sector, and some data on the Cambridge active companies, and we have some data obviously on the public sector, and we track this and the rates of growth every year. To give you an idea of how, if you recall, that when I had that pub drinks in 1979, we had counted that there were 36 Cambridge-based technology companies in the area. Well, things have changed a bit since then. This is the latest data draw. This is the number of companies, their total employment and their total turnover for the year up to April 2020. So it's a year ago. It's just before COVID. So it's kind of, who knows what it'll be like after COVID. But we're talking a knowledge intensive sector there. You can see just 5,372 companies were actually based and grown up in Cambridge, of which information technology is clearly a very large sector, but life sciences, with much fewer companies, 631 life sciences companies, is got almost the same amount of employment and a larger level of turnover. They tend to be much bigger companies, much harder companies. And then you've got some manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing businesses, and the knowledge-intensive services like Cambridge Consultants and the Technology Partnership. And the total business that turns over in the Cambridge area, 18 billion, employing 67,000 people in companies. And then the rest of the businesses in Cambridge being obviously manufacturing businesses, retail and distribution, construction, and so forth. And we track how much of this is knowledge intensive, and you can see there that 28% of employment in Cambridge companies is in the knowledge intensive sector. That is probably over double the nearest other towns, barring Oxford. And if I take the rate of growth of this, you will see that I'm taking a 6-year figure. We track it annually, but I'll show you the 6-year number to sort of give you the longer term trend. You can see there that the employment growth, which is the most important one in terms of the size of the town, that Cambridge, across that period, these companies grew at over 6%. Life sciences grew at nearly 10% per annum. So this is a per annum growth. This is not 6% over 6 years. This is 6% per year over a 6-year period. So it evens out the volatilities. But actually, this is a pretty steady rate of growth by these companies. So we're talking about a large economy, very heavily weighted towards knowledge intensive, which is particularly rapidly growing. And we map this. I can show you, this is showing you life sciences. Just watch the dots. I'm afraid I'm a very sad person. I actually find this rather fun. This is Cambridge. As you can see, the sort of triangle, inverted triangle of Cambridge. And you can see the biomedical campus at the bottom of near Addenbrooke's, and we've got the science park up at the top. Now, just right down the bottom, you've got the Wellcome Sanger Institute, which is the other sort of pink blob, and then you've got Granta Park and Babraham. And just watch the dots, because this is actually watching each year the change in the companies, and the size of the dots reflects the size of employment. So if I just watch it, you can see the dots growing across 4 years. If there is, you go back, there is economic growth before your very eyes. Okay, let's come on to then what these companies do. Well, noticeably about Cambridge companies, they are deep science companies. This is not marketing-driven ideas. They're not apps. This is stuff based upon fundamental research that comes out of the university, and it's very deep. It's very significantly so. Only a few sort of parts of the world have this kind of depth of science. They tend to be professional, selling to businesses rather than to consumers, and they are professional sales rather than marketing-led. They export very early on, they're involved in global markets from very early on, and they internationalize, they get into manufacturing, they internationalize their manufacturing capabilities. They will be building things in the Far East if they're going to have them manufactured, but they control the designs from Cambridge. They have been very active participants in the consolidating globalized technology markets, and companies here in Cambridge have particular skills at getting into the supply chains of the very, very big dominant American tier one companies. They're called Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft. And the companies in Cambridge are very smart at building dominant supply positions in critical high value areas. Voice recognition is a Cambridge phenomenon now. There's one man in the university, Steve Young, who was Pro-Vice Chancellor as an engineer, who has formed 3 companies in the voice recognition field. He sold the first one to Microsoft, he sold the second one to Google, and he sold the third one to Apple. I think he's retired, although I wouldn't put it past him to be back at the research lab. And Amazon also came to Cambridge. So when Apple bought his voice technology company called Vocalist, they said, we're moving it to Cupertino, and the staff said, no, we're not, we're staying here. So Siri, which you have on your phone and your watch, lives in Cambridge now, and up the road is Alexa, literally 300 yards up from where Apple is based is where Alexa is based. So Cambridge is the center for voice recognition. It's also center for sound recognition. The company called Audio Analytics, for example, has the world's largest catalog of sounds, which they will build into your phone. So when you are washing your hands with your Apple phone, the Apple phone is recognizing the noise of the water and is then showing you a visual on your phone about how long you should be washing your hands. There's a company called Owlstone, which is actually doing smell recognition. And it has an ability to smell cancer, which is something they're developing at the present time. What happens then when these companies build these very strong positions where they're serving several of these different very big companies is that they get acquisition approaches from their customers. And the result is that they are usually sold in a competitive trade sale. IPOs are being really quite rare, but the size of these trade sales is pretty substantial. So, for example, we've had $50 billion of acquisitions in Cambridge companies since 2011. So this is quite a notable center. We have a very deep non-corporate research capacity. Remembering that we have 67,000 people in companies, we have another 37,000 people in research positions in a range of laboratories that have come to Cambridge. One of the things that happened was a lot of London labs in the noughties and or in the noughties particular, decided it was better to come to Cambridge because they could get more bangs for their buck, sold their premises and brought themselves down to Cambridge. And this is a very big centre of science now. And besides the university, there are a whole series of labs built up around this. And they have a large population. It's grown, eased down from 6.2% to about 3.8%. But one of the major sites, for example, is the Wellcome Trust Centre at Hingston Hall, where IBM was originally thought it was too far out to go, which is where all the genome sequencing for our pandemic is taking place. There are many MRC units. Anglia Ruskin is here, and the hospitals are now all concentrating on the biomedical campus. As you know, it's not only Addenbrooke's now, but we have the Rosie maternity hospitals, we have Papworth, Royal Papworth Hospital, and there is now discussion about raising funds for a children's hospital and separately for a cancer hospital. So South Cambridge is becoming a major biomedical centre. And obviously alongside that is then bringing other charitable entities like Alzheimer's Research or the National Institute of Agricultural Botany, which is in the north side of Cambridge. So the population of laboratory researchers is equivalent to 55% of the company employment. So it is a very major centre, over 110,000 people now in Cambridge employed in knowledge-intensive activities. And then the Cambridge active companies, these are the companies who are kind of not based here, like Apple, like Amazon, have started to come because they're very attracted by this ecosystem. So we've had a noticeable influx in the knowledge-intensive area, and they've also bought Cambridge companies. Now, we can't track the employment of these companies in the same way. We have to rely on our local intelligence, but to give you an idea of the kinds of numbers of companies, you have 185 technology businesses have now come in from outside. That makes up nearly 20% of all the companies, of the active companies in Cambridge. And to give you an idea of some of the names, these are the kind of companies that now have active offices in Cambridge because of the technological growth here. So that gives you a run through of where we are. And the last section I want to just talk about is, is this sustainable? There are many elements here that we have which are very strong. We have the entrepreneurs, we obviously have the universities, we have the right attitudes, which is very important, and the networks. Infrastructure I'll come back to in a moment, but we have by and large built up a really successful ecosystem in the last 60 years. Question is, can we make it sustain? And this actually is a serious point. Those of us who live here have engaged in active debate, as they do in Silicon Valley actually, about whether this the strains of growing an economy at this kind of pace can be managed inside an old British country town. Well, I've been actively involved in this, and the history of looking at this is actually quite old, in that the university had a Department of Architecture study called Cambridge Futures 1 and 2, which in 1997 to 2001 looked at the future shape of Cambridge under Lord Brewers, who was then Vice Chancellor. And they made some very important decisions about releasing green belt, that's kind of undeveloped farming land, both on the northwest side of Cambridge and for Addenbrooke's biomedical campus. And the third transaction they were talking about was to actually relocate Marshall's Airport, which didn't happen. But that decision, those decisions that came out of Cambridge Futures 1 and 2, much accelerated local growth. So when I started looking at this area, I was concerned that the growth was very high, and people were not aware of how high the growth was. The ONS, that's the Office of National Statistics, and the councils had in mind that Cambridge was growing at something like 1.5% to 2%, when in fact our numbers were starting to show that it was growing at something like 6%. And although the council has been very active in supporting the growth of housing, putting in over 2% per annum in the growth of housing, the demand coming from the growth of the employment in the area is just outpacing supply. Our road and rail infrastructure was not keeping up, and the very high growth was putting enormous stress on house prices, commuting, and road speeds. The effects of this were that Cambridge's footprint was spreading outwards. So the South Cambridge was growing very fast, as is East Cambridge, as the city has spread outwards and as people are forced to live further out. And the effects of this are kind of quite noticeable. For example, here is a graph of the Cambridge house costs versus a university lecturer's salary. And you can see that we have very high accelerated house prices, which are now equivalent to buy a house 13 times average salaries, which is not a sustainable number. The actual number of people who work in the city and live in the city has been declining because as people have aged and as some people have started to commute to London. But increasingly, the light blue line is what is happening, is that people are coming into the city every day to work. And so there's something like 50,000 people commute into Cambridge City every day and have to live further out. And Cambridge is now regarded as one of the most unequal cities in Britain. And of course, if you take the speed of traffic, you can see in the light blue line that the morning peak speed has fallen well below everywhere else. So I initiated a study, which was on Cambridge Futures 3, with a lot of this data and with modelling techniques. And we looked at the whole of Cambridgeshire, and we have modelled the growth of Cambridge out to 2051 to see if we can achieve low stress but high growth. And our models suggest that by 2051, Cambridge could be a city the size of Sheffield or Bradford, but that it is possible for this to be done in a way that is balanced and sustainable. But it does require some big investments in infrastructure, and particularly in mass transport. So there are now plans which are being brought forward quite actively to build a Cambridge South station at the biomedical campus that are talking about linking railway to Oxford, coming in from the west side of Cambridge, where there used to be a railway. I'm old enough to have travelled on that railway before it was closed by Dr. Beeching. And there is an active review now, plan going on to build a metro system in Cambridge, which would be one of the first small city metro systems, rather like Boston's system. And to support this work, we undertook what's called an independent economic review under Dame Kate Barker, who reported to central government in 2018 and supported the kind of modelling work we were doing and the radical transport solutions that we had outlined in that. And with the government now being very strongly behind the Oxcam arc, it is likely that these investments will be made. But the idea, the kind of ranges of growth, this is Cambridge and South Cambridge, both could grow between 400 and 200,000 each. So that would be a sort of overall city of about 400,000, but possibly up to 500,000 by 2051. Where would this be? Well, the idea is that there are certain sites, there are 5 sites which in the center would become very much densified. Let's say the Science Park at the top. Marshall's Aerodrome will be redeveloped and become a major business center, probably about 40,000 people working there. Obviously, the University at Eddington and the West Cambridge site is a major growth point to the west there. And then the biomedical campus of the south, where plans again already has 22,000 people working on the biomedical campus and is forecast to grow to over 40, and the centre around the station. And then more broadly outside of Cambridge, these are the kind of areas where along the transport spines, we can envisage much more growth going out along Balsham Road out towards 6 Mile Bottom and Dullingham, the whole of the Genome Centre around Sawston and Babraham and Great Chesterford, and then Cambourne as the northwest corridor opens up with the Cam arc, as well as the expansion up towards Waterbeach. So these are kind of the major quadrants which will likely to see growth. And then twinned with that, we will have what's called a nature network. This is based around, identify where you are. This is 5 nature parks which we're in the process of launching. One expanding the area around Wandlebury, which is a sort of chalk downland. The river corridor expanded right from Babraham and from south near Duxford all the way up through the centre of the city. An area around Coton and the rifle range in the west. And then interestingly, a whole area I was never aware of, which is the Cambridge Fen, which is to the northeast, where there's some interesting developments there of fenland. So these are natural parks which we're specifying now so that when the city grows, it has that continued kind of country feel of access to cows on the backs that we've all grown up with. Why is the Cambridge economy special? Well, here's some ideas that have changed the world. The first one is Solexa. This was an idea dreamt up by John Berriman and Shankar Barasubramanian. They founded Solexa, which became the business that does the sequencing of the genome and is bought by Illumina, a business monoclonal antibodies. There's Greg Winter in his younger days produced the world's largest, most valuable drug, Humira, which has grown into Cambridge Antibody Technology. It was then bought by MedImmune and has then been the basis on which AstraZeneca have relocated themselves to Cambridge. And then, of course, in the computing field, you've got Herman and Chris Curry and Acorn Computers as descendants of Alan Turing, who today graces our £50 note, and Clive Sinclair, their great rivals next door to them. And then Robin Saxby and Warren East, growing ARM, which of course, as you know, is a major semiconductor chip provider to all our mobile phones. And then perhaps slightly less to crow about, but autonomy, there is Mike Lynch, whose business was sold to Hewlett Packard for $11 billion. Much disputed whether it was worth that. And there are other businesses recently being bought by, for example, Sanofi. But we have created some very big businesses here, and Aviva is another name I could put on here from the combined computer-aided design center, which is now the largest computer-aided design software business in the world. So we have made some ideas that have changed the world. And perhaps I should stop by just turning over to Bill Gates. The phenomenon of Cambridge, its university and its cluster is an inspiring reminder to the great power of human ingenuity to create new enterprises and industries to make life better and more productive for all of us. Thank you. I hope that whirlwind tour through the new Cambridge economy has been enlightening, and I'm delighted now to take questions and answers. And I think, Kate, you can join me in doing so.
So much, Matthew. Thank you. Well, we've had a couple of questions come through in the little Q&A box, but do feel free to pop them in there or in the chat function if that's easier. So first of all, we have Ian Ellingham, who I know joins us from Canada, asks, was this development a creature of a specific time and place? And is the current emerging generation more or less entrepreneurial than that of a couple of decades ago?
Well, it clearly, I hope the story is specific, is quite a specific story. It did not occur in many other places. It did occur here. And actually, if you wanted to compare it with Oxford, it didn't happen in Oxford in anything like the same time frame. Oxford really, for all the depth of science in and around Oxford, did not spark in the same way until much later. Is it continuing? Is this entrepreneurial field there? Very much, very much. I mean, I'm on the advisory board of a number of the accelerators in Cambridge, and there is absolutely no shortage of people. It's kind of become, I mean, when I was a master, we had a number of businesses that were started by students, and they just kind of, it is what people now feel is a perfectly acceptable way. When I left Cambridge in 1970 as an undergraduate, you went into the civil service, publishing, and maybe if you were slightly commercial, you went into accountancy. Now there's a whole range of people regarded as completely normal that you want to set up your own business and join the small business and grow the technical capability. So yeah, it's very active.
The next question we have is from Matt Parrish, who says, do you compare Cambridge to other centres / competitors when you analyse business activity?
Well, I would love to be paid to do the same detailed analysis of, say, Oxford or Manchester that we do on Cambridge, but we kind of do look. I mean, obviously, the place we look at, everybody looks at, is Silicon Valley. So we're about 10% the size of Silicon Valley. That gives you an idea of order of magnitude. But these kind of self-sustaining centres, of which really kind of the key ones are Cambridge, Oxford, Boston, Silicon Valley, and maybe Stockholm is now getting to this point. When one looks at places, there are some cities like Utrecht in Holland, which are clearly quite active. But I mean, we thought that Munich was going to be one of the big stars, and then it kind of somehow it hasn't sparked in the same kind of way. We think Berlin is a German centre. It's got the kind of some of the right kind of feel, but we don't have the data on it. And the trouble is, this data that you really have to work to get the data out. I mean, the work I do with my colleagues do basically takes them about 3 months a year to get all that data out every year. So it's very hard to track it to that degree of detail. I wish more people would do what we do. We've said to them, we've said to Oxford and we've said to London, if you want us to show you how we do this, because there's a technique to this, we're very happy to let them, to teach them and let them do it. We aren't trying to be proprietary about it.
Yeah. And while we wait for a few others to pop up, there are a number of current students of the college on the call at the moment. Do you have any advice for them, those who might not be operating already, you know, as students in the business school, you know, people who think that this might be something that they want to explore? What advice would you have for them as they're trying to combine studying, finishing their PhD with potentially forming a company?
Well, I think it's, first of all, I think it's hard to start a business as an from undergraduate. What these businesses have, what they start with, is a kind of depth of technical expertise which you get from in-depth immersion in a particular field. Really that comes from PhDs. There are some master students who will try and do it, but really they haven't got the depth of kind of exposure to the sector or to the technology. I think that there is a kind of, everybody seems to feel that it's very easy to do. It's very easy to start a business, but you can do the wrong kind of business. You can start businesses that are too hard, that kind of you jump to an idea that you know what the market wants before you've actually tested the market. And if you make those decisions and wrongly call it, then you go bust. So the kind of the idea of understanding the soft way of starting a business is, I think, just study that a bit more. But above all, just get into the business marketplace, if you're going to do this, and work in other companies, you know, to learn who the buyers are and so forth. There is a great deal of support now. I mean, if I take this, obviously the Judge now runs an accelerator program. It runs Enterprise Tuesdays. There's the Impulse program out on the West Cambridge site, which also does training courses on starting up businesses. There's a postdoc society for of other entrepreneurs. I mean, there are quite a few societies where you can just meet other students and just talk about your ideas and pick up things from there. And there are a lot of mentors around. A lot of people have made good money in doing this and just want to give back. So, for example, I'm on the advisory board of the Impulse Centre on the West Cambridge site. And I think we have something like sort of 20 mentors, all who've got really good careers behind them, who just are willing to help people set their business up, and they put money in. I mean, I've done that. You know, just say this is an attractive business, and I'll give you advice, and I'll put some money at your disposal.
And with all of that said, obviously the students of this academic and last have been operating under extraordinary circumstances. what impact do you think the nature of the pandemic and the effect it's had on the way we work will have on the phenomenon you describe? I mean, you talked about the pioneers of voice recognition, you know, refusing to leave Cambridge, but obviously many of us can now do our jobs from anywhere in the world, and it's completely acceptable. So do you think that will impact on the kind of physical, the need to physically locate in Cambridge?
It's a really, really good question, Kate, and it's kind of the $64,000 question at the moment. I think when the COVID broke out, my colleagues who were working with me on the Cambridge Futures 3 work, who happen to be Chinese. I mean, Ying Jin is a naturalized British, but he has Chinese roots. I said to him, look, we should go off and find out what happened in the Far East when they had SARS. What is the impact of a very large outbreak of this sort? And the feedback was very interesting. It said, by and large, some lessons we could actually have learned if we'd got through to certain gentlemen in Downing Street. Do not try to reopen too early. Make sure you're completely on top of the pandemic before you do so. But the other thing that came out was that once the life could return to normal, people did revert to going back into cities and working in offices again. Now, that was before Zoom. I mean, here we are. This is unimaginable in 2002, other than by very clever people. So Zoom has changed things, but the tendency has been, if you've gone to the Far East, that people went back into cities. There are two things which are particularly important, I think. One is obviously if you're working in a technical field, you can't do everything on a computer. You've actually got somehow to be, you know, at a workbench or with your animals, or, you know, whatever it is your experiments are on. And there's quite a lot of our teaching and our labs in Cambridge, which just, you know, are specific sites. You've got to be there. So I think on the technical front, there certainly will be a draw back in towards working in centres again, rather than being at home. The other thing which is very marked is that you don't, a lot of innovation and a lot of learning comes from being with people in offices or in labs. And particularly younger people are, it's okay for people like me and even like you, Kate, who can sort of sit at home and do your thing from far away because you're established. But if you're anxious to get on in your career, you want to pick up the tacit learning that you learn about the company or whatever, you have to do that in the office or in the workplace. So I think that we will find there are some draws, but I think we will end up with a hybrid. Yeah. I think that people undoubtedly have discovered nature, discovered the attractions of working at home to a degree, but I think it'll be typically from work that we've done in Cambridge Ahead, looking at younger people's attitudes. They would like to have up to 2 days at home a week. We shall see. I think it'll evolve, and I think actually what will happen is, although people will start fairly hybrid, it will tend to be dropping back to maybe a day or maybe half a day in time.
So Charles Cotton has popped up with a question. He says, the University of Cambridge evolved to understand the benefits of entrepreneurialism. Do you believe that the UK government will understand the benefits and soon enough?
I think one of the very interesting things, I go back to the very first question, Cambridge is, I was involved, I chaired the very first study of the phenomenon written by Nick Siegel. And I was in the bank and I thought that we should tell the story of how Cambridge had started up so that others could learn from it. And very early on, in fact, some of the very first companies that I was involved with had DARPA contracts from the US government. DARPA is this Defense Advanced Research Program agency. And the American government was very well aware of the very earliest stirrings of technology companies in Cambridge. I can think of 3 companies that I financed which had DARPA contracts. So I kind of went down to the DTI, as it then was, and said that the bank was prepared to put up some money to finance this this study. Were they happy to come in and join us? And they said, anything special happening in Cambridge? And they were completely unaware of the developments in Cambridge, and frankly, were not terribly interested. They never became interested in entrepreneurialism until, Charles, you'll know this, until Gordon Brown and Peter Mandelson started spatting about the excitement of clustering. So I wrote the first paper on clustering to the British government when I was on the DTI's advisory board in 1990. And I remember this paper went to the advisory board as a kind of new idea, and the managing director of GEC said, nonsense, clustering doesn't matter. Weinstock's comment about Cambridge was a flash in the pan. So I think the kind of the London understanding of these kind of entrepreneurial clusters is very poor. And the Treasury itself, and I talked to the head of the Treasury's regional economic policy, Will Garton, and I said to him, do the Treasury actually understand how these ecosystems grow? He said, no. I genuinely think they do not understand it, because it is not classic economics, the way in which Cambridge has grown.
Yeah. Got another question from Patrick Mitten, who asks, do you expect that the medical science research surrounding COVID will accelerate the growth of medtech to a dominant position in Cambridge, more so than prior to the COVID outbreak?
Yes, and I think that the kind of the license, in a sense, people realise how important it is, and the role of the Sanger Centre in particular in doing genomics on these new variants. Just generally, we are as a society going to be vastly more aware about pandemics. This is a new societal threat, and therefore we are going to equip ourselves properly. And Cambridge will, I mean, I've got to say Oxford has been probably slightly better beneficiary than Cambridge, but Cambridge has got a very big role. Our genomics is probably stronger. Yeah, a big role. And in fact, the truth is I've already seen the plans emerging for the expansion of the biomedical campus. It will be very big.
Thank you for sharing your incredible research with us and your many years of experience. I hope that all of you who joined us this evening enjoyed it, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yeah, me too.